Hello and welcome. Something lingers at the edge of every elven legend. Something gray and quiet and older than the oldest name ever spoken aloud. Most histories of the elven people begin in shining halls, with gleaming towers, with the silver-lit groves of the Feywild, where the very first elves danced in starlit meadows, and heard the voice of their creator echoing through boughs that had never once known winter. Those are beautiful stories. They carry real truth in them, but they are not the whole story. Before we descend into these histories, please consider subscribing to the channel. It is the surest way to find your path back to our library of lore when you wake. Section 1. The Ancient Elven Fracture. Because somewhere in that same ancient age, there was an elven kingdom born from the Feywild itself. A community of immortal people gathered around a queen of extraordinary power and extraordinary conviction. These elves believed in her the way that only people who have watched the world burn for a very long time can believe in someone who seems to have an answer to the fire. They believed she could do something impossible. They gave her everything they had to make it possible. Their magic, their souls, the most intimate and irreversible gift they had to offer. And when what they gave her for did not go as intended, it pulled every last one of them out of the bright and living realm they called home, and dropped them into something gray and cold and permanent, and they never fully came back. You know their descendants today as the Shadar-Kai, and once you truly understand where they come from, you will never look at a shadow quite the same way again. To understand the Shadar-Kai at the deepest level, you have to go back further than most people ever go when they tell stories about elves. Not just back a few centuries, not just back to the great wars of Faerun's recorded history, but back to the very beginning of the elven people, back to the age before the world wore the shape it wears today. The elves did not begin here. They did not begin in any forest or on any mountain range on the material plane. They began in the Faywild, that shimmering, breathing dimension of wild magic and endless life that exists alongside the material world like a fever dream pressed against a sleeping mind. The Faywild is not simply a pretty place. It is a realm of raw, unfiltered existence, and everything there is more. More beautiful, more dangerous, more emotionally saturating. The light there does not just illuminate. It soaks into you, fills you up, makes your skin feel like it is humming with everything the world can offer. The music of the Faywild does not just please the ear. It moves through you like water moves through stone, slowly and completely, and with a patience that eventually reshapes everything it touches. And the magic of that realm is not something separate from its landscape. It is the landscape. It lives in the roots of the trees, in the currents of the rivers, in the very air that swirls between the branches of ancient groves that have never once been touched by fire or frost. It was here, in the heart of this impossible place, that Corellin Larethian shaped the first elves from starlight and song. The oldest and most fragmentary accounts in Elven's scholarly tradition suggest that the earliest of Corellin's children may have been more fluid in their nature than the distinct lineages that came after, perhaps less fixed in physical form and more deeply woven into the magical currents of the realm that birthed them. These accounts are genuinely ancient and interpreted differently across different scholarly traditions, so we can hold them only loosely. What we can say clearly is that these early elves were creatures of emotion and magic in deep balance, and the Feywild poured into that balance and nourished it generously. Beauty, wonder, purpose, connection. The first elves wanted for almost nothing. But immortal lives are long, and long lives accumulate differences. Even among those first elves, individual temperaments pulled in different directions. Some were drawn to open water and wide meadows flooded with golden light. Some found meaning in the deep forests, in ancient groves, where the trees pressed together so tightly that no light reached the ground, and the silence had weight and texture to it. And some, even in those earliest ages, were pulled toward the quieter edges of the Fay-wild, the dim and misty borders, where the brilliant light of that realm thinned out and the air grew still. Those particular elves found something in that dimness that the brighter places could not give them. A kind of rest, a kind of honesty. The roaring beauty of the Feywild was extraordinary, yes, but it was also relentless. And in the quieter margins of the world, those elves could exist without being overwhelmed by it. This was not a corruption. It was not a warning sign being ignored. It was simply the first hint that within the fabric of the Elven people, there was a thread that resonated with something cooler and more still than the rest. And over the long centuries, the elves who carried that thread within them would find each other and gather and build something together in the dim and quiet margins of the Feywild. A community shaped by a shared temperament, a kingdom in time, with a people, a culture, and eventually a queen unlike anything the Elven world had yet produced. Then came the Crown Wars. The Crown Wars are among the most catastrophic events in all of Elven history, and the scale of them is difficult to hold in the mind all at once. They stretched across roughly 3,000 years, an arc of violence so sustained and so total that it permanently reshaped every dimension of Elven civilization. What began as political and cultural rivalry between the great Elven kingdoms of the ancient world eventually escalated into campaigns of outright annihilation. Brother nations raised armies against brother nations. Ancient forests were burned down to bare soil, bloodlines were cursed and driven into the earth. The shining elven civilization that had grown in the Feywild and then spread outward into the material world began to tear itself apart from the inside. Arivendar launched its campaigns against the dark elves of Miaritar, and in doing so set off a chain of events that cascaded across the whole of the elven world. Other kingdoms were drawn in, some willingly, and some because they had no choice. The dark elves, who would eventually become the Drow, were cursed by Corellin himself and driven permanently beneath the surface of the world. Other groups scattered, transformed, migrated across vast distances in search of safety, or survival, or simply a corner of existence that had not yet been lit on fire by someone else's ambitions. You have to sit with what 3,000 years of war actually means. 3,000 years ago, in the history of our own world, was before the Great Pyramids were constructed, before writing had been invented, before metal had been shaped into any kind of tool. The elves lived through all of that time, consumed by a conflict with themselves, watching everything they had ever built crumble, watching the dreams their ancestors had dreamed in the Feywild turn to ash and ruin. The emotional weight of that must have been staggering, even for immortal beings, perhaps especially for immortal beings who could not simply die and be done with it, who had to carry each new loss across the centuries and add it to every loss that had come before. And beneath the war between kingdom and kingdom, there was a fracture at an even deeper level. The conflict between Corellin and Lolt, ancient and bitter and ongoing, predating the crown wars themselves, was expressing itself in the mortal world through the divisions it seeded in the elven people. The Drow had not simply been driven underground because of mortal politics. They had fallen because a divine rupture had found expression through them. Any elf who thought clearly about the shape of what was happening could see that the wars between kingdoms were downstream of something far older and far more dangerous than any single political rivalry. It is here that the surviving sources grow fragmentary, and different traditions preserve different pieces of the story with different emphases. What they agree on, and what modern scholars who have studied the question most closely tend to accept as the most likely reconstruction, is this: the queen of that quiet, dim-edged Feywild kingdom saw all of it clearly. She watched the wars. She watched the Drow fall. She watched the fracture spreading, and she traced it upward to its source. She understood that the conflict between Corellin and Lolt threatened to tear the Seldarine asunder entirely, and that as long as that divine rupture remained unhealed, the elven people would find no lasting peace in the mortal world, no matter how many wars they won or lost. She made a decision. Based on what the sources preserve, her intention was to enter Arvendor, the divine realm of the Seldarine and confront the conflict at its source. Not to take power, not to rule, to stop the fracture before it finished breaking everything. This could imply that she had access to knowledge of divine cosmology, far beyond what most elven scholars of her era possessed, or that she had already made contact with forces that granted her insight into what was happening at the level of the gods themselves. What we know without ambiguity is what she asked of her people when the time came. She needed their power. She needed their souls. She designed a ritual that would draw on the collective magic of every willing member of her kingdom to carry her across the threshold from mortal into divine. And her people, every one of them, said yes. They pledged themselves completely. They gave her their magic and the intimate spiritual weight of their own souls to fuel what she intended to do. The conviction of that moment must have been something staggering to witness. These were not people being coerced or deceived. They were people who had watched the world fracture across centuries of unending war, and who had a queen who looked at the source of the fracture and said she could reach it. They believed her without reservation, without condition. What they could not have known was that something had already decided to stop them. And the ritual, when it finally began, did not go where any of them had intended. Section 2. The Raven Queen and the Pact. The ritual moved through them like a tide going out. That is the closest the oldest accounts come to describing it. The feeling of something being drawn from each of them, gently at first, a slow and deliberate pulling of the deepest part of themselves toward their queen, toward the working she had built for this single, enormous purpose. They had given their consent freely. They had prepared for this. And in those first moments, based on what the most careful reconstruction of surviving sources can tell us, it felt like exactly what it was supposed to feel like. It felt like offering, like devotion made into something physical and real and directional. A river of collective elven soul and magic flowing upward toward the woman at the center of everything, carrying her toward the threshold of the divine. And then something changed. The sources that describe what happened next are fragmentary and, in places, deliberately incomplete. What we know is that others had been watching. Wizards, the accounts call them, which may be the most compact word available for beings whose precise nature and motivation the surviving traditions do not fully illuminate. What we can infer from those traditions is that these figures had been aware of the ritual, aware of the enormous concentration of elven magical and spiritual power being channeled into a single working. And they had seen in it something they wanted for themselves. They had found a way to connect themselves to the flow of it, to link their own existence to the souls being offered, drawing power from the offering that was never intended for them, queen perceived this. She interrupted the ritual to confront them. And that interruption is what undid everything. A ritual of that scale and that specificity cannot be simply paused. It cannot be held mid-working, while the architect of it steps away to handle an unexpected problem. The enormous channeled force of every soul in that kingdom, all of that magic and intention and devotion that had been set in motion toward a single purpose, had no graceful way to stop when the center of it was suddenly broken open. What had been a controlled and directed current became, in a moment that must have been deafening in every metaphysical sense, something uncontrolled, something that needed somewhere to go and found the nearest available destination. Her soul was pulled downward, not into Arvindor, where she had intended to go, in the opposite direction entirely, through the skin of the living world, and into the gray and lightless plain beneath it, the Shadowfell. Her mortal body, separated from the soul that had animated it by a force it had never been built to survive, died. Her followers, still bound to her through the working they had collectively offered themselves into, were dragged with her, not as violently, not as completely, but pulled nonetheless out of the Feywild and into the gravity of the realm that had just swallowed their queen. What arrived in the Shadowfell was a soul that the ritual had already half transformed. The working had been partially successful before it broke. She had been altered by the channeled power of her entire people, carried partway across the threshold of the divine. And she arrived in the Shadowfell not as a mortal woman, and not as a god, but as something hovering in the space between the two. Nearly divine. Not enough to be stable. Not enough to survive the Shadowfell on her own terms, without the realm consuming what remained of her. She made a choice in that moment that the sources present as the only choice available, to avoid being entirely unmade by the Shadowfell's drain. She wrapped herself in it. She took the nature of the realm and pulled it into herself deliberately and completely, used it the way you would use a tool, or the way you would use a shield, or the way you would use a skin when the skin you were born with has been taken from you, and something has to take its place. She became the Shadowfell in the same moment that the Shadowfell became her. The power was contained. The nearly divine soul found something to inhabit. And what rose from that process was not the Elven queen who had entered the ritual. It was something new, something that no longer carried a name, because the name had belonged to a mortal woman, and mortal women do not survive the kind of transformation that had just occurred. She was the Raven Queen. The cost of becoming her was almost everything she had previously been. The memories that had made her a particular person with a particular history in a particular community of people who loved her. They did not survive the transition. Not cleanly, not intact. The Shadowfell which she had wrapped around herself to survive, took them the way it takes everything from everything that dwells within it long enough. The grief of the war she had been trying to end, the faces of the followers who had trusted her with their souls, the specific texture of her life in the Feywild before any of this began. All of it thinned and dissolved into the gray. What she retained was power. What she retained was awareness. What she retained was a deep and permanent and aching understanding that something essential had been lost. Without the specific content of that loss being available to her, she knew she had been someone before this. She could feel the outline of it, the shape of an interior life that no longer had furniture in it. She had become the queen of memory and the preserver of the memories of the dead. And she could not remember who she had been when she was alive. This is the version of her origin that the most current and widely referenced canon presents, the one found in the pages of Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes, the 5th edition sourcebook that brought her and the Shadar-Kai into their fullest narrative development. It is worth noting, because this is a tradition with multiple versions, and older players may know a different story, that an earlier telling of her origin, rooted in the 4th edition of the game, described a different path to the same destination. In that tradition, she was a mortal queen who performed a ritual during the Dawn War, the ancient conflict between the gods and the primordials. And through that ritual, she slew Neril, the cruel god of death who had long fed on the suffering of dying things, and took his divine portfolio for herself. In that telling, her memories were also lost in the transition, and she emerged from the act as the Raven Queen with the same grief and the same aching absence at the center of her existence. Both versions agree on what she became. They differ on the road that carried her there. When this script refers to her origin, it draws from the 5th edition account, which grounds her directly within Elven history and connects her to the Shadar-Kai at the most intimate possible level. She was not an external power they found. She was their queen before she was a goddess. Her followers, pulled into the Shadowfell through the broken ritual, found themselves in the gray and quiet realm in a condition that was both better and worse than simply dying would have been. They were alive. Their bodies had made the crossing intact enough to function, but they were bound through the working they had participated in to the Shadowfell itself and to the being at the center of it. Their souls were not entirely their own anymore. They could feel the difference the way you can feel a thread tied around a part of yourself that you cannot quite reach, present and persistent, and not painful exactly, but constant. The Shadowfell began almost immediately to do what it does to all living things within it. The colors of the world muted. The emotional bandwidth narrowed. The bright and saturated quality of life in the Feywild receded behind a gray distance that they could not close no matter how hard they reached toward it. And their queen, the woman they had followed, was now something that no longer remembered following her had ever been the arrangement. She existed in the Shadowfell at its center, in a realm she had made her own through the force of what she had become. And the particular human shape of the bond between her and her people was lost, along with everything else she had been. What remained was something older and more structural. They were still connected to her. The ritual had seen to that, and she, in the strange and grief-saturated awareness she now carried, recognized what had arrived in her realm. She recognized the marks of the working on them. She recognized their souls the way you might recognize a piece of your own handwriting, even if you cannot remember writing it. The service that followed was not a negotiation made between equals meeting for the first time. It was the continuation of something that had already been in place before any of this happened. They had always been her people. The Shadowfell had simply removed the context that explained what that meant, and what was left was the bare structural fact of it. They served her because that was what they were, at the deepest level, before the ritual, during it, and in the gray and permanent aftermath of its failure. She gave them what she could in return: stability within the drain, a measure of protection against the erasure that the Shadowfell deals out to unanchored living things. And more than that, she gave them something that would become, perhaps, the most defining aspect of Shadar-Kai existence in the centuries that followed. When they die, even far from the Shadowfell, on missions in the material plane, or in any other corner of the multiverse, she draws their souls back. She preserves them. She returns them to bodies. The Shadar-Kai are not immortal in the conventional sense, not immune to death as an event. But death for them is not the end it is for most beings. It is a pause. It is the Raven Queen collecting what belongs to her and handing it back when she is ready. This could imply a kind of mercy. It almost certainly also implies a kind of ownership. The souls she preserved during their crossing are the same souls she still holds. The relationship between the Raven Queen and the Shadar-Kai is tender in the way that the most complicated relationships are tender, full of genuine care, expressed through forms that would look to an outside observer like something close to possession. Her realm in the Shadowfell, what the 5th edition canon calls the Fortress of Memories, sits at the dark heart of that plane and is in every sense a physical expression of what she is. The 4th edition sourcebooks gave it the name Leatherna, and some older traditions still use that name. The 5th edition material describes it more by function than by name. It is a place built around the preservation of what has been lost, vast and lightless and cold, staffed by attendants who venture near it only carefully and with purpose. Even among the Shadar-Kai themselves, who serve the Raven Queen and belong to her in the most foundational sense. The Fortress of Memories inspires something close to fear. What the Shadowfell took from their queen, it will take from them too, if they go deep enough into it, if they remain too long within the presence of the full weight of what she has become. They serve her from a respectful distance. They approach the center of her power when called, and do not linger when the calling is finished. It is the most honest possible architecture for a relationship between a people and their God. She is theirs and they are hers, and neither of them remembers exactly when that was freely chosen rather than simply true. And so they live in the gray, and they serve her, and they carry the marks of everything the ritual cost them on their skin and in their hearts. And the Shadowfell holds them all like something precious that it is very slowly, very patiently learning to keep. Section 3. The Shadowfell's Long Embrace. The Pact changed the terms. It did not change the place. The Shadowfell was still what it had always been, and no connection to any goddess, however powerful, was going to soften the fundamental nature of a realm built entirely from the concept of ending. The Shadar-Kai had been given an anchor. What they had not been given was comfort. What they had not been given was ease. Living in the Shadowfell was never going to be easy, and the longer any people spend inside a place that runs entirely counter to the biological and spiritual logic of living things, the more that place leaves its mark on them. The Shadowfell leaves marks the way a river leaves marks on stone. Slowly, completely, and with an indifference to the stone's preferences, so absolute it barely registers as cruelty. To understand what happened to the Shadar-Kai over the centuries that followed, you need to hold in your mind a clear picture of what the Shadowfell actually is. Not the poetic version, not the shorthand, but the real and full weight of it. The Shadowfell is a plane of existence that occupies the same cosmological space as the material plane, but reflects it through a lens of grief, exhaustion, and finality, rather than life and growth. If you were to stand in the same geographic location in both the material plane and the Shadowfell simultaneously, you would see the same mountains, the same rivers, the same general shape of the land. But in the Shadowfell, those mountains would be darker, as if the light that fell on them had been somehow taxed on its way down from the sky and arrived spent and thin. The rivers would run in colors ranging from deep gray to a black, so total it looks like liquid absence. The sky above you would be permanently overcast, not with the dramatic and promising clouds of a coming storm, but with the flat and featureless gray of a sky that has given up on ever being interesting again. And the light in the Shadowfell is perhaps the most disorienting thing about it for any creature that has spent significant time under a real sun. It is present, technically. there is a son of a kind, a pale and distant thing that tracks across that gray sky and provides just enough illumination to see by. But it gives no warmth. It carries nothing of the ultraviolet promise of spring or summer. It is light that has had everything essential removed from it, the way a meal that has had all flavor, all nutrition, and all joy removed from it still technically contains calories. You can survive on it. You cannot thrive. Plants in the Shadowfell do not grow toward the light the way they do in the living world. They grow in spite of it, hunched and angular and gray-leaved, as if photosynthesis in that place requires more effort than the sun is willing to repay. The animals adapted to that realm exist in a place where emotions do not register in the environment. A forest in the Feywild responds to joy. The trees lean in when music is played near them. The flowers open more fully in the presence of laughter. In the Shadowfell, nothing responds to joy. The environment is not hostile to it exactly, but it is profoundly indifferent, and that indifference is its own kind of pressure. After long enough, living things within it begin to mirror the environment rather than the other way around. This is what the Shadar-Kai were living inside of. This is the medium they were breathing in and building their homes within and raising their children under. And the Shadowfell's effect on them over generations was not dramatic in any single moment. It was the accumulation of 10,000 small moments, each one barely noticeable on its own, that together added up to a transformation so complete that a Fay-wild elf who had known their ancestors would barely recognize what they had become. The physical changes deepened and solidified with each generation born within the Shadowfell. The ashen, cool-toned skin that the first arrivals had begun to acquire became simply what Shadar-Kai skin looked like. Not a deviation from a norm, but the norm itself, passed from parent to child with the same inevitability as any inherited trait. The pale hair that ranged from white to silver, to the very faintest ghost of a color that might once have been brown or gold. The eyes that carried that particular quality of gray or white or pale blue that looks, in certain lights, less like a color and more like the absence of light within the iris. These were not traits that any individual Shadar-Kai chose. They were the accumulated record of centuries of residency in a realm that imposes itself on everything that stays long enough. But the physical changes, striking as they are, were the least significant transformation that the Shadowfell worked on the Shadar-Kai. The deeper and more consequential change was emotional. And it is here that the story of the Shadar-Kai becomes something that asks you to genuinely sit with a kind of suffering that is unusual and easy to misunderstand from the outside. Emotions for the Shadar-Kai do not work the way they work for other people. This is not a metaphor This is not a poetic way of saying they are a stoic culture or a people that frowns on public displays of feeling. The Shadowfell, over enough time, alters the spiritual architecture of a living being's emotional processing. Feelings do not simply flow through a Shadar-Kai the way they flow through a human or a sun elf or a halfling who has never set foot in a shadow realm. They arrive muffled, as if wrapped in several layers of heavy cloth. They are present, but distantly. A Shadar-Kai in the midst of something that would reduce another person to tears of joy or grief might feel only a faint stirring, a subtle shift in the quality of their awareness, the emotional equivalent of hearing music from 3 rooms away and through 2 closed doors. And here is where it becomes genuinely difficult to sit with. The numbness does not also numb their awareness of the numbness. That is the particular weight of the Shadar-Kai condition. They can perceive the outline of where an emotion should be. They can recognize intellectually that a given moment deserves to be felt deeply and fully. They carry the memory of what feeling things sharply was like. Or their culture carries it in stories and traditions, even if no individual person alive has personally experienced it. They know what they are missing. They reach for it. They press their hands against the gray gauze between themselves and the feeling, and they push. And the gauze holds, and they are still there on the wrong side of it. This creates one of the defining behavioral patterns of Shadar-Kai culture, the thing that outsiders often find the most surprising or the most difficult to understand about them. The desperate and relentless pursuit of sensation. Not necessarily pleasure, though pleasure is part of it. Sensation in the broadest and most inclusive sense of the word. Any input intense enough to pierce the muffling. Any experience sharp enough to make the feeling arrive, fully rather than as a distant echo of itself. Pain accomplishes this with a directness that nothing else quite matches, which is why so many Shadar-Kai carry ritual scarification, elaborate body modifications, and tattoos that cover large portions of their bodies. The act of marking the skin in those ways is not merely decorative, though it is that too. It is a way of insisting on the reality of the body. It is a way of saying, with evidence written directly into the flesh, that you are still here, still present, still capable of feeling something that arrives without the gray delay. Cold is another reliable route. The Shadowfell is perpetually cold, and most of its inhabitants have adapted to it in the way that all things eventually adapt to their environments. But there is a particular and specific intensity of cold, the kind that bites rather than simply settles, that can cut through the emotional muffling in a way that milder temperatures cannot. Battle accomplishes this too, which helps explain why the Shadar-Kai have historically produced some of the most formidable warriors in the Shadowfell and beyond. the focused violence of combat, the sharpness of attention required to survive it, the physical intensity of it. These things have a way of burning through the gauze and delivering genuine, immediate feeling. A Shadar-Kai who has spent weeks feeling nothing more than a distant murmur of their own inner life can step into combat, and for the duration of that fight, feel completely and vividly present in a way that nothing else reliably provides. There is no judgment in this. Understanding it requires setting aside whatever associations the words sensation-seeking carry in other contexts, and recognizing them for what they are here. It is not recklessness or a failure of self-discipline. It is a people doing what any conscious being does when their connection to their own inner life is being steadily severed. They find the tools that work, and they use them with the seriousness of someone performing maintenance on the only instrument that still tells them they are alive. And there is an additional layer to this that makes the Shadar-Kai relationship with sensation more complex than simple pleasure-seeking. They know that death is not the end for them. The Raven Queen draws their souls back. She preserves them and returns them to life. This means the fear that drives their sensation-seeking is not the fear of dying. It is the fear of something that death cannot solve, and the Raven Queen's gift cannot prevent. The fear is about what can happen while they are still breathing. Because the Shadowfell's drain does not stop at emotional muffling. Left unchecked, left without the stabilizing effect of the bond they carry or some other anchoring force, the process continues. The emotional distance grows. The gray gauze thickens. And at the far end of that process, where no anchor holds and no sensation is intense enough to penetrate anymore, the Shadar-Kai face something that their culture regards with a dread that goes all the way down to the root of who they are. The 5th edition sources describe this end state in terms that are not simply metaphorical. A Shadar-Kai who has lost the fight against the Shadowfell's erosion entirely does not simply become quiet or withdrawn or emotionally absent in the way a depressed person might be emotionally absent. They begin to lose the distinction between themselves and the shadow realm itself. The boundary between a living person and the surrounding Shadowfell grows thin, and in the most extreme cases, it disappears. What the sources describe, and what Shadar-Kai culture preserves in its stories as the thing most worth fearing, is the transformation of a living person into something shadow-adjacent. Something that still moves and drifts through the world, but carries nothing of the person who was there before. A being of living shadow, present but empty, belonging to the gray in the most complete and most irreversible sense. This is what gives their sensation-seeking its urgency. Every tattoo, every ritual scarring, every plunge into biting cold, every chosen battle, every act of deliberate sensation, however intense, is also an act of self-preservation in the deepest sense, not preservation of the body, preservation of the person inside the body. Because in the Shadowfell, those are not the same thing, and only one of them is worth fighting for. Their culture has built language around this distinction that does not exist in most other traditions precisely because most other traditions have never needed it. The Shadar-Kai have words, stories, and ceremonies for the difference between being alive and being present, for the difference between existing and persisting, for the strange and specific grief of watching someone you love begin to thin at the edges, their particular selfhood dissolving degree by degree into the gray, their eyes going from muted to vacant to the flat and lightless quality that means you have already lost them, even though the body has not yet understood that. And they have, in the end, the knowledge that none of it is without purpose. The Raven Queen collects what the Shadowfell takes. The memories that dissolve out of the living go somewhere. They go to her. She holds them in her fortress of memories with the same care and the same hunger she brings to the memories of every mortal soul that passes through her domain. What is lost from the Shadar-Kai is not gone from the universe. It is preserved in the hands of the being who understands the value of memory better than any other entity in existence, because she has lost her own so completely that she spends eternity trying to understand what that loss means. This could imply a strange kind of comfort if you hold it at exactly the right angle. The gray does not win. It takes, but she keeps what it takes. And the Shadar-Kai, in their pursuit of sensation, in their insistence on remaining people rather than shadows, are doing something that their goddess understands from the inside more deeply than they can probably imagine. They are fighting to remember what it felt like to be alive. She would know exactly why that fight is worth having. Section 4. Society, Culture, and the Palace of Memory. A civilization built inside a dying world still carries the instinct to be a civilization. That is one of the most quietly remarkable things about the Shadar-Kai. They did not simply survive in the Shadowfell. They did not simply endure it, pressing themselves flat against the gray and waiting for something better to come along. They built, they organized, they created a culture with its own internal logic, its own values, its own forms of beauty, and its own understanding of what it meant to live a life worth living even when the realm around them was always, in its patient way, suggesting that nothing was worth anything at all. What they built is strange by the standards of any sunlit civilization, but it is coherent. It is intentional. And once you understand the conditions it was built to answer, it is, in its own way, extraordinary. Shadar-Kai society is organized around the central fact of the emotional drain. everything flows from that. Every social structure, every cultural practice, every tradition preserved across generations has been shaped, consciously or not, by the fundamental challenge of maintaining selfhood in a realm that erodes it. Where other civilizations organize themselves around resource acquisition, or military power, or the expansion of territory, Shadar-Kai society organizes itself around the preservation of the interior life, around the question of how a people remain a people when the world they inhabit is trying to dissolve them. The result is a culture that places extraordinary value on things that many other societies treat as secondary. Memory is revered in a way that approaches the sacred. Not just personal memory, though that is deeply important, but collective memory. The accumulated record of who the Shadar-Kai have been across all the centuries of their existence in the Shadowfell. The Raven Queen herself is the ultimate expression of this value in divine form. She collects the memories of the dead with a hunger that the Shadar-Kai recognize instantly because they carry a version of the same hunger. Memory is evidence. Memory is proof that something happened, that someone existed, that the gray and the quiet did not win. To lose your memories to the Shadowfell's drain is to lose the argument that you were ever really there. This reverence for memory expresses itself in concrete cultural practices. Oral traditions among the Shadar-Kai are not simply a method of passing information between generations. They are treated as a form of maintenance, the way you might maintain a building against the slow damage of time and weather. The stories are told regularly and carefully, with attention to detail that goes far beyond what would be strictly necessary for simple information transfer. Names are important. Specific moments are important. The particular texture of experiences long past is important. An elder Shadar-Kai, who is known to carry particularly intact and detailed memories of the distant past, occupies a social position that has no real equivalent in most other cultures. They are not simply respected. They are essential. They are the living record that the Shadowfell has not yet won. The body itself is also treated as a site of memory and resistance. The elaborate tattoos and ritual scarifications that mark most adult Shadar-Kai are not purely ornamental, though they carry genuine aesthetic significance within the culture. They are, among other things, a physical record. Different markings carry different meanings across different communities and traditions. Some indicate significant events survived. Some mark relationships with other individuals or with specific places in the Shadowfell. Some record acts of service rendered to the Raven Queen. To read the markings on a Shadar-Kai's body is to read a compressed autobiography, written in a language that requires cultural fluency to interpret fully. And the act of making those marks, which involves real and sustained physical sensation, is simultaneously a form of record keeping and a form of the sensation seeking that keeps the emotional life sharp and present. The same act accomplishes two things at once, which is entirely in keeping with a culture that has learned to waste nothing. Their clothing and aesthetic sensibility reflect the Shadowfell in ways that are beautiful once you have shifted your frame of reference away from sunlit standards. Blacks and deep grays predominate naturally. Silver is the most common accent appearing in jewelry, in the metal fittings of weapons and armor, in the threading of certain garments. The aesthetic favors clean lines and deliberate austerity, rather than the elaborate ornamentation that some other elven cultures favor. There is something in the Shadar-Kai aesthetic that functions as a response to the Shadowfell's blankness, an insistence on intentional visual composition in a realm that otherwise offers only formless gray. If the Shadowfell cannot be made beautiful in the way that the Feywild is beautiful, then beauty can still be made within it through the deliberate act of craft and will. The city of Gloomrot, established in detail through the 4th edition sourcebooks, stands as the most significant Shadar-Kai urban center in the Shadowfell, and gives us our clearest picture of what their civilization looks like at its most developed. It is a port city situated on the shores of a great shadow lake, and ancient in a way that accumulates in the stones of its buildings and the expressions of its permanent residents. The architecture is tall and angular, built from the dark stone that the Shadowfell provides in abundance, with towers that lean slightly in ways that suggest either great age or the subtle distortion. The realm occasionally imposes on structures that have existed within it long enough. The streets are narrow in some places and wide in others, with no obvious organizing principle, because Gloomrot did not spring from a planned design, but grew organically over centuries of habitation and expansion. The city is not exclusively Shadar-Kai. This matters. Gloomrot is one of the few places in the Shadowfell where the full range of beings who have found themselves in that realm, willingly or otherwise, can exist in something approaching proximity without immediate violence. Undead move through its streets alongside the living. Other shadow-touched beings who have made the Shadowfell their home occupy different districts with their own internal social structures. Merchants from the material plane occasionally find their way there, drawn by the particular goods that only the Shadowfell can provide. The Shadar-Kai are not the only inhabitants of Gloomrot, but they are its oldest and most deeply rooted ones, and the culture of the city reflects their values in its architecture, its social codes, and its relationship with the broader power that the Raven Queen represents. Her presence is always felt in Gloomrot, the way the pressure of deep water is felt at the bottom of an ocean, pervasive and structural, rather than visible in any immediate sense. Her will moves through the city in the actions of those she has chosen. Her champions and agents who carry out errands that are not always explained to those who witness them. Her authority is not administered through visible courts or daily proclamations. It is ambient. The inhabitants of the city understand this and order their lives accordingly. The Fortress of Memories, which is what the 5th edition sources describe as her domain at the dark heart of the Shadowfell, and which the 4th edition sourcebooks named Leatherna, is not a place that the Shadar-Kai themselves approach lightly or often. This is a point worth pausing on, because it is easy to imagine her chosen people moving freely through her halls. The reality the sources describe is considerably more charged than that. Even for the Shadar-Kai, who are bound to her more deeply than any other living beings in existence, the Fortress of Memories represents a concentration of everything the Shadowfell is and does at its most absolute. The drain that affects ordinary Shadar-Kai communities is a trickle compared to what gathers around the center of her power. To go deep into that fortress is to risk the very erasure that their entire culture has been built to resist. They do not congregate there. They approach when called, with purpose, and with the specific kind of courage that belongs to people who understand exactly what they are walking into. What the Fortress of Memories contains, in the 5th edition account, is the accumulated weight of mortal memory. The recollections of the dead, gathered and preserved with an attention that the Raven Queen brings to almost nothing else. Rooms and chambers filled with the emotional residue of lives that have ended, organized according to a logic that only she fully understands. She moves through those stored memories with the hunger of a being searching for something she cannot name, trying to reconstruct through the experiences of others what she herself has lost. The Shadar-Kai understand this hunger because they carry a version of it. They are searching for the edges of their own, feeling in every sensation they pursue. She is searching for the edges of her own history in every memory she collects. The shape of the search is the same, even if the scale is vastly different. The highest form of service available to a Shadar-Kai is not residence in the fortress. It is selection as one of her champions, her agents sent outward into the material plane and beyond to advance her will in the living world. These individuals are sent specifically because the work of maintaining the boundaries of death and the proper order of passing souls cannot be done from within the Shadowfell alone. The living world generates its own complications. Necromancers who refuse the natural order, undead that persist beyond their proper time, souls that are stolen, hoarded, or corrupted by forces that have their own ideas about what death should look like. Her champions address these things directly, moving through the mortal world as her hands and her eyes, and, when necessary, her weapons. The magic she grants her champions is not the standard portfolio of power that people associate with death-adjacent divine domains. It is something more particular. It is the power of shadow as a medium, the ability to move through shade and darkness with a fluidity that transcends normal spatial constraints, to become briefly insubstantial, to step through shadow the way other beings step through doors. In terms of the game itself, the 5th edition presents this as a suite of abilities that allow the Shadar-Kai to teleport through shadows and become resistant to damage in their ghostly state, reflecting in mechanical terms the deep and intimate relationship with shadow that their long residency in the Shadowfell has built into their spiritual and physical nature. It is worth spending a moment here on the way this lore has developed across the game's history, because tracing that evolution illuminates something important about how the Shadar-Kai have been understood and what has remained consistent across every version of them. In the 3rd edition of the game, the Shadar-Kai appeared in the Fiend Folio, presented as Shadow Fay, creatures native to the plane of shadow that existed in a state between the fully living and the fully dead. They were humanoid and Fey-touched, with the ashen aesthetic and the cold, sharp quality that would persist through every later version. Their connection to any divine patron was not yet central to their identity in this telling, and they were presented primarily as inhabitants of the shadow plane, rather than as a people with the kind of deep cultural history that later editions would develop. The plane of shadow in that era was a somewhat simpler cosmological construction than the fully realized Shadowfell that would replace it. And the Shadar-Kai of that era reflected their environment accordingly. The 4th edition of the game transformed them significantly. In that edition, the Shadar-Kai were presented as humans, mortals who had pledged themselves to the Raven Queen and been transformed by that pledge into shadow-touched beings living between life and death. The 4th edition also established the Raven Queen as a major divine figure in its own right, with the origin story placing her as a mortal queen who had slain Neril, the ancient god of death, and claimed his divine portfolio during the Dawn War between gods and primordials. This version developed the emotional drain, the sensation-seeking, the warrior culture, and the intimate bond between the Shadar-Kai and their goddess with real depth and specificity. Many of the most beloved elements of Shadar-Kai lore that players carry today were crystallized in this era, and the 4th edition treatment remains extraordinarily rich, even as the specific cosmological framing has since been revised. The 5th edition, and specifically Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes, published in the year 2018, brought them back to an elven origin and embedded their story within the broader history of the elven people in ways that connected them to every other part of that vast lineage. The corrupted ritual, the elven queen who sought to stop the Corellin-Lolt conflict, the souls pledged to fuel an ascension that went catastrophically wrong, the plummet into the Shadowfell, the emergence of the Raven Queen from the wreckage of what the Queen had been. All of this gave the Shadar-Kai a depth of history that stretched back to the earliest ages of the Elven world and made them not an anomaly, but one more expression of the extraordinary range of what elves can become when history and choice and catastrophe work together across the long arc of immortal lives. The 5th edition also formalized their resurrection ability, the Raven Queen drawing their souls back from death as a core part of their racial identity. Regardless of which edition first brought you to them, the essential truth of the Shadar-Kai has remained constant across every version of their story. They are a people shaped by loss, sustained by service, and defined by their refusal to disappear quietly into the gray that surrounds them. The specific shape of the story that explains how they got here has changed as the game has grown and developed. The emotional and spiritual core of who they are has not moved at all. Section 5. The legacy of the Grey Children. That is the part of the Shadar-Kai story that tends to get lost when people focus entirely on the Shadowfell, on Gloomrot, on the Fortress of Memories, and the gray and patient realm that shaped this people across so many centuries. The Shadowfell is their home. It is the place that made them what they are. But home and prison are different things, and the Shadar-Kai have always known the difference. Among a people defined by their relationship to sensation and their refusal to let the gray swallow them entirely, the impulse to move outward, to test the borders of what their existence can contain, has always been present. Throughout their long history, individuals and small groups have stepped out of the Shadowfell and into the broader multiverse, carrying everything that the Shadow Realm built into them and pressing it against the full color and noise and overwhelming immediacy of the world beyond. The experience of a Shadar-Kai crossing from the Shadowfell into the material plane for the first time is something that their culture has developed language for, because it is significant enough to deserve language. The color alone is almost disorienting. Not unpleasant, disorienting in the specific way that any extreme sensory shift is disorienting when your nervous system has spent years calibrating to a narrow and muted range. The green of living forests, the blue of open sky without a single gray cloud pressed across it, the gold of actual sunlight, real sunlight, the kind that carries warmth as well as light, and arrives on the skin with something that feels almost like a physical pressure. For a Shadar-Kai who has spent their entire life in the Shadowfell, the material plane is an assault that is also a relief, overwhelming and welcome in equal measure, arriving all at once and without any of the gradual adjustment that would make it manageable. They feel more there. That is the simple and profound truth of it. The emotional muffling, that is simply the baseline condition of existence in the Shadowfell loosens when a Shadar-Kai steps into a realm that is not constantly pulling at the threads of their inner life. Feelings arrive more directly, more fully. A Shadar-Kai standing in a sunlit meadow on the material plane might experience something that the rest of the people around them would describe as ordinary appreciation for a pleasant afternoon, but which for that Shadar-Kai carries an intensity that their entire frame of reference has not prepared them for. Their emotional calibration has been set to the muted scale of the shadow realm for so long that what registers as mild in anyone else registers as vivid and startling in them. What feels like a gentle breeze to someone born under an open sky can feel like the first real breath after a very long time underwater. This creates a complicated relationship between the Shadar-Kai and the world beyond the Shadowfell. The material plane and the other brighter realms of the multiverse offer them something the Shadowfell cannot easily give. Real feeling, immediate and unfiltered. The thing they have been reaching for their entire lives, present and accessible in a way it simply is not back home. But prolonged exposure to the material plane carries its own demands for a people so thoroughly shaped by the shadow realm. They are not built for the full sustained intensity of a world that generates constant emotional input without pause. The same sensitivity that makes bright sensations so precious to them also makes the accumulated weight of an emotionally rich environment genuinely exhausting in ways that most material plane inhabitants would not understand. The adjustment required to exist comfortably in that balance is not something that happens quickly or easily, and for some Shadar-Kai, it never fully settles. Those who choose to live permanently or semi-permanently outside the Shadowfell occupy a position that is unique in the multiverse and often quietly lonely. They are not fully of the gray world they came from, not in the way that those who serve close to the Raven Queen's domain are bound to it. But they are not fully of the brighter world either. They carry the Shadowfell with them in their bodies, in their pale skin and ashen hair, and the cool, particular quality of their eyes. They carry it in their emotional architecture, which remains fundamentally different from the emotional architecture of beings who have never lived in a place that drains feeling the way the Shadowfell does. They exist between things in a way that has no clean resolution, belonging completely to neither world, navigating the gap between them with whatever combination of will and adaptation they can build over time. Within the broader family of elves, the Shadar-Kai hold a position as complex as their history suggests it should be. The elven peoples of the material plane have long and intricate relationships with each other, shaped by thousands of years of shared and divergent history, by the crown wars and their aftermath, by the choices that sent each lineage down its own particular road. The high elves, the wood elves, the sea elves, the drow, and all the others exist in relation to each other in ways that range from cautious cooperation to deep mistrust, to the specific grief that comes from recognizing something of yourself in a face that is also profoundly different from your own. The Shadar-Kai fit into that constellation in a way that most Elven scholars find genuinely difficult to categorize. They are clearly elves. The lineage is present in their bone structure, in the length of their lives, in the particular quality of their magical connection to the world around them. The signature of Corellin's original design is readable in them even through all the gray layers the Shadowfell has pressed on top of it. But they are also clearly something that no other Elven lineage has become, shaped by a catastrophe at the source of their people that left them irrevocably transformed in body and spirit. The gulf in lived experience between a Shadar-Kai and a wood elf who has never left their grove is not simply cultural difference. It is a difference in the fundamental texture of daily consciousness itself. How Corellin regards the Shadar-Kai is not something the available sources address directly or in any explicit detail. What we can reasonably infer, based on what we know of his character as the Seldarine's patron and his complex relationship with every divergent branch of his people, is that the grief of what happened to them is not something he stands apart from. The ritual that created them was an attempt to help him, after all. Their queen, his child in the oldest genealogical sense, gave everything she had in an attempt to heal the fracture in his divine house. That this could imply anything other than an ongoing sorrow on his part would be difficult to support. He did not curse them the way he cursed the drow. He did not drive them underground or cast them out of his design. What became of them was not a punishment, but a tragedy. And the distinction between those two things matters enormously in how we understand the Shadar-Kai's place within the larger Elven world. The drow chose Lolt, or at least a version of that story holds that they did, with everything that choice implied. The Shadar-Kai chose their queen, and their queen chose to help Corellin, and the attempt was derailed not by a failure of devotion, but by the interference of those who had no claim to what was being offered. This could suggest that the Shadar-Kai occupy a particular position in the Elven cosmic order, not the fallen branch, but something more like the wounded one, still of the family, still carrying the mark of the original making, changed not by betrayal, but by a catastrophic act of love that the multiverse did not have the grace to honor properly. There is a philosophical dimension to the Shadar-Kai that rewards sitting with quietly, in the way that the best lore always rewards contemplation rather than simple cataloging. They are a people who entered a transformation they did not fully choose and could not fully control, who found themselves in a condition of permanent and irreversible change, and who then built something meaningful inside the constraints that condition imposed. They did not transcend their circumstances. They did not find a way to undo the Shadowfell's mark, or reclaim the Fay-wild brightness of the ancestors whose lives preceded the ritual. They made a life inside the gray, with the gray against the gray, because the gray was what they had, and a life made honestly inside real conditions carries a truth that an ideal life constructed only in imagination never can. Their entire culture, every tradition and practice and art form and social structure and deeply held value is an answer to a question that no other people has been asked in quite this way. How do you remain yourself in a place that is always, patiently, trying to unmake you? How do you hold onto the particular quality of your own existence when the environment you live in is fundamentally indifferent to whether that quality survives? How do you love something, feel something, be someone specific when the medium you breathe is made of endings? The Shadar-Kai answer is in the tattoos on their skin. It is in the cold they seek, and the battles they choose, and the stories they tell with more detail and more care than is strictly necessary, because the detail and the care are the point. It is in the sensation they pursue not as distraction, but as evidence. It is in the service they render to a goddess who understands their condition from the inside, who has her own version of the reaching and the grasping and the reaching again. They are the gray children of an ancient love that went wrong in the worst possible way at the worst possible moment. They are the living consequence of a queen who tried to fix something that was breaking, and who paid for the attempt with everything she had been, and whose people paid alongside her. They are elves who carry the Feywild in their lineage, and the Shadowfell in their bones, and the Raven Queen's bond in their souls, and the memory of warmth in every sensation they press themselves toward, knowing the warmth will never arrive the way it did before, knowing that and reaching for it anyway. They are still here. They are still reaching. And the reaching, after everything the multiverse has done to make it harder, is the most elven thing about them. Thank you so much for spending this time here. Take care of yourselves, and I will see you in the next one.